Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the podcast, Not Quite Strangers. My name is Valerie Hope. I'm so excited to introduce some new guests to you. As you know, every episode is an opportunity to get curious about some of the people that we have, but also they're curious about each other, I'm sure. It's an opportunity to shift perspectives as we learn new things about one another, new ways to think about certain things, and hopefully by the end, establish a connection. So you all, the listeners, get to establish a connection with those that you're hearing as our guests. And the guests, you too get to establish a connection with each other. If you haven't already, favorite us or tag us or subscribe on any of your favorite podcast platforms so that way you don't miss a single episode. And now for the pièce de résistance. I want to introduce my two guests today. One, we'll start with Karabi. So Karabi, you and I know each other because we're both in the same writing class for 3-4 months earlier this year. And it was fascinating to hear some of the things that you were writing about. And specifically because you're a child of mixed race, right? You talked about mixed race experience. And I was like, oh man, it would be so interesting to talk to you. And as I've heard pieces of your book and stories that you were planning to share, I'm like, I need to know more about your experience, but I know there's somebody else in my life that I think could have some interesting takes also. And that's why I introduced to you now, Sara. Sara is my sister-in-law, Karabi, and Sara and my brother have been married for 20 years? 22 years? My gosh, 22 years. And they have 5 kids who are all mixed race. And we talk about race a lot with your kids, Sara. And so I just thought the conversation would be really interesting because you, the perspective, Sara, of a mother of mixed race children, and Karabi, you, a person of mixed race who also have your experiences, and because of your book, hoping to convey some experiences and perhaps some wisdom and knowledge to other people. So welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you.
I'm curious. I don't know if I've ever asked this question, but when I invited you, first of all, what did you think about the podcast when I invited you to come? And second, why did you say yes? Either one of you.
Well, I can start. I mean, first of all, I'm trying to get into a place of saying yes to as many things as possible. So that was part of saying yes. I have not read Shonda Rhimes' book, The Year of Yes, or whatever it is, but I like that. I like the concept. And then just the sort of the concept behind this podcast, Valerie, I think is so cool. I think just virtual meeting of strangers and having a conversation as if we're in a cafe. I just think we need more of that. So I love the concept behind it.
Cool. Thanks, Karabi. Sara, what about you?
Well, you asked me a few times before, and I was always pushing you off. And I just sort of ran out of excuses, I think, to participate. So, yeah, you know me well enough to know that I'm not always jumping at new experiences and being out there and social and whatnot. But but I figured that, once I get going, I usually have a wonderful time getting to know people and talking. It's just that initial push to start. So
just have to break the seal. I know, Sara, you have a lot of things going on. For those of you who have tuned into this podcast for some time, you have seen other members of Sara's family on the podcast. Ricardo, her husband, my brother, her daughter, Carly, her daughter, Rosa, has been on the podcast as well. So it's a family of podcast stars over there in the making. So this, first of all, I'm also curious now that I've mentioned to you all the connection that I saw between the two is this idea of the mixed race. What are your what are your reactions to that discovery? I don't think I'd shared this with you when we first spoke, right? No, got it. So I'm curious, what's your reaction as I said that? What came to mind?
Well, I was super excited. All I am, you meant, so I am in the process of writing a book about sort of navigating multiracial or mixed race identity in the United States. And so it's kind of all I'm thinking about, talking about, living and breathing. And so, yeah, I'm just super excited to hear your experience, Sarah, and the conversations you're having and what you're hearing from your kids as well.
Sarah, what about you?
Well, you mentioned, Valerie, we do talk about race a lot in our house. It is a big topic, and it is it's sort of a through line of a lot of our conversations and a lot of our experiences. And we live in a really wonderfully diverse neighborhood. And so we're getting to experience our own, having lived in lots of places and now living here. It's something that I'm always looking for tools to have these conversations and to just to navigate them in a responsible and an empathetic way, because I am not mixed race. But all the people I love are. So yes, I'm really excited. I'm really excited to learn from you, Karabi, and get a sense of what the journey looks like, and how I can frame conversations with my own family.
Ooh. So let's jump in. I think, since you mentioned, Sarah, this idea of being responsible and empathetic, I think from the sense of responsibility, I feel the first question should be to ask the two of you, maybe share a little bit of the origin story here, right? So Karabi will start with you. Maybe share where you're from, or what's your family makeup? What is this mixed race identity that, if you could describe it for us, what would it be? And how did you feel about it growing up? Like some of the origin piece.
Yeah, sure. So so my mother was white American of English and German ancestry, and my father is from India and actually is sort of a refugee because he was caught up in the partition of India. So he was originally from an area which is now part of Bangladesh, but used to be part of India. And then when India was partitioned, his family, had to leave, and is now from Calcutta, West Bengal, part of India. And so, it's funny because in my family, we didn't talk about race, which is kind of crazy because my mother was a sociology professor and she taught race, she taught class. She was a child of the 60s and, marched for civil rights and women's rights and things. But what sort of kind of was interesting to her and to me later is that I was in my 20s when she kind of came to me and she said, "Do you identify as a person of color?" And that was like our first conversation about that. And it was a huge moment for her of realizing how how, I mean, this is a while ago. I'm of an older generation, I guess I'm supposed to say that now, but
you don't have to. You're of the right generation. There's no older.
But no one was talking about it, right? No one, people were, this was the 70s, right? So it was sort of post 60s civil rights era, but before sort of where we are now. So she just she was really blind about it, despite the best of intentions, the best of, all the academic knowledge. It just never occurred to her. And I think part of my journey, it stems from this realization that mixed people or multiracial people like are just generally invisible, right? Usually you're asked to pick one. Right. Mm-hmm. And you think about the most famous multiracial people, you think about Barack Obama or even Kamala Harris. They've been very open about that they chose to identify as Black. And, you know, and I think that, you know, first of all, I think everyone has the right to make that choice, but I also think there's pain in that, right? And I know for me personally, I identify so much with both of my heritages and cultures. I've lived in India for a long time. I've lived in the United States for a long time. I really think of myself as bicultural, and I can't give one up. Like you know, and I would never want to give one up. And so, you know, so I think that's been a part of my journey. But I think one of the reasons why I'm so excited to talk about it these days is because I feel like finally there's beginning to be a little bit of conversation about this. But when I was a kid, there, you know, you were Black or white and there was nothing else.
Mhm.
And so when I was neither, that was just confusing to people. That was, no one knew how to deal with me. I didn't know how to deal with me, you know. So that, I don't know, that's a little bit, I could go on forever, but that's a bit of my own story.
All right, Sarah, reactions. I have a few thoughts too, but I want to hear what Sarah says first.
I think, I mean, it's really fascinating to consider the sort of generational changes in how people view mixed race. And it was really interesting hearing about how your mom like demonstrated through her actions that she was accepting and that she was open-minded, but that it wasn't like an explicit conversation. And you know, I sometimes wonder, in our own home, we are explicit in our conversations, but are we also demonstrating? Like, do our actions also support what we're saying? And so, yeah, that's really interesting. And I want to know more. I'm like, oh, I'll have to read the book. No more.
So Sarah, tell us a little bit about your origin story too, about how you came to be a part of this family.
Well,
Created this family.
Yeah. I grew up in New England. I have two very white parents, one of French Canadian descent, which is very white, and then one of Irish American descent, and lived in Vermont, which is the like second whitest state in the country, and grew up, never really talked about or experienced any sort of or saw any sort of racism, but it was just absent. There wasn't an opportunity for racism because it was so homogenous. Mm-hmm. Then I joined the military, left for college, joined the military, and still not, looking back, not incredibly diverse, but far more diverse than I had experienced. Met my husband, fell in love, got married right after I graduated. And while we were dating, was never an issue in the military bubble. It never really occurred to me that it was anything special, or, you know, probably meeting your family for the first time was like a little bit stressful, just in terms of like, oh, you know, like this, it was, I'd seen my husband be the only Black person in the room many times. Mm-hmm. And I had never been the only white person in a room. Mm. And so all of a sudden I had to navigate that. And that gave me a lot more perspective. And yeah, we got married. And that was the first time when I went out into the world, that I got some comments, like, I had a superior in the military who saw my wedding photo and basically asked me if I was on good terms with my parents, because he assumed that there would be tension because I had married someone of a different race, which was laughable to me. I was like, I don't really understand the question, but based on his background, that was something that would have been like, he didn't indicate that he had any issues, but he was like concerned that I might have some family issues, which I did not. Then later on, you know, kept having babies, and it probably wasn't until my oldest was maybe 8 or 9 that it really occurred to me that she would identify as a person of color. I'd always really just viewed her as my child. And that, you know, she was half me and half her dad. And but you know, I sort of realized, and Ricardo had talked to me about it, my husband, and so it took a little bit of time for me to sort of warm up to the idea that it's not a slight on me that she identifies as a person of color, but that's the world she navigates, and all my kids now. So and as they've gotten older, we talk a lot more about it. They're obviously, my oldest is 17, so she's getting ready to go to college, and my children all look different also. So we talk a little bit about colorism and you know, what's acceptable sibling teasing and what's not acceptable sibling teasing, like what lines do we not cross. And yeah, so that's the, you know, knowing that they're getting ready to go out into the world, and aren't going to be seen as a part of this unit where, oh, there's your mom and dad. Okay, that makes sense. But to be seen as just individuals, autonomous individuals, and how are they going to identify themselves and be identified? And yeah, so that's us.
This is interesting. And Karabi, I want to get your reactions to that. I think the one thing I want to say, first of all, is I wonder that the question that pops up in my head is if this is a relationship with race that in this country, in the US, seems to be more prevalent. Like, I wonder how other people relate to it. Because we grew up, you know, we're from Panama originally and grew up in a fairly diverse community too. We had a lot of different ethnicities in the city where we lived. But I don't remember race or color or any of those things. At least at my age, I was 9 when we left. So perhaps maybe as you get older, for sure. I know there is definitely racism and colorism in Panama. That's a fact. And I just don't recall that ever being a challenge in the friendships that I made or in the school experiences that I had. So I'm curious about how that looks here. And Karabi, I know you mentioned you lived in India for quite some time. So I'm curious about how that identity played out there. And Sara, like if you were in a community that was predominantly Black, like what that would have done, the dynamic in the conversations with your, you know, with Ricardo or with the kids, or, you know, how much of this society, the surrounding community plays a part in how that plays out. That's always fascinating to me. But Karabi, I want to hear what's your reaction to what Sara shared so far?
I mean, I think my reaction is just, Sara, I just, you know, I think it's so fantastic you're having these conversations, because because when you don't talk about it, it becomes like, it has the potential to become like a source of shame or something that's like bad about us or something like that. And so I, you know, just hats off that you're just having those conversations. And I'm sure they're messy and I'm sure they're all kinds of things, but it's so good that you're talking about colorism and talking about all of this. And I think the other thing I was thinking as you were talking is just sort of in a way, the advantage I think that your family has, that your husband is Black, because he can, and Black American, well, I guess you maybe, or Panamanian, I don't know when. Yeah.
But that's another podcast episode.
But it sounds like he understands the US context enough that he can maybe be a bit of a guide to your kids of like, what is it like to be a person of color, and how do you navigate a society that has a lot of structural racism and things like that. Whereas in my case, my dad was from India and didn't, he was a foreigner and didn't understand. He came as an adult, a young adult. But I think even to this day, and he's 86 now, he and lived really his whole life in the US, except for early years. I still think there's a part of him that really doesn't, like, he could never be my guide. He could be my guide in India, but he couldn't be my guide in the US of what it was really like to be a person of color in the US, because he himself was still kind of figuring it out and coming to terms with it. And he also had such strong sense of identity and roots in India. Like, that is his home, that is his identity, that is where he belongs. And whereas I found myself like, well, where's my home? Where do I belong? Because I often felt rejected in the US and I often felt rejected in India. I was born in Belgium, actually. I certainly wasn't Belgian. And and I think the other thing that I think, so the multiracial people is the fastest growing demographic group in the United States. And I think we were talking about sort of generations. I think people who are kids now are going to have the benefit of hopefully lots of people in their circles who are multiracial or biracial. And I was 23 before I met someone else who was biracial,
Wow.
believe it or not.
Wow.
Like, not in college, it was graduate school. So not in high school, not in college, not in elementary school. Now, it's possible there were kids there who were biracial but identified as Black and I just didn't know it. But there was certainly no like mixed Asian or mixed, there were, I was in a small town in Illinois. There was only at the time one other Indian family, and they were like, full, and both parents were Indian. So, it's a different world. And I think it's going to be in some ways an easier world to navigate for the people who are coming up now.
There's a parallel that I want to draw. Sarah picked up on it when Carly, your oldest, was 8-9 years old, this idea of her being a person of color, right? And Karabi, you said your mom didn't really articulate it until you're in your 20s. And so what is that awareness and what impact does it have? Like, so Sarah, when you had that moment, we were like, oh yeah, how did it inform your mothering? Like, how did that inform your relationship?
I think the biggest thing for me was that I assumed that I could navigate any challenge that came up based on my own experiences. And realizing that my children were indeed, that the world viewed them not as my darling, offspring, but as people of color, that my experiences weren't necessarily relevant. Some are, like being a woman, maybe being a woman in a male dominated field, or, things like that, being in a leadership position or things like that. But I have to acknowledge that I don't have all the answers, and that I didn't experience all the same challenges that they are experiencing. And a big part of that is the privilege discussion, and I had to come to terms with my own privilege, and being able to identify, that there are things that I've never had to worry about, and that doesn't mean that those issues don't exist. I feel like I feel very fortunate to have a really solid understanding of what white privilege is in America, but I don't know that I would have that if I wasn't in my family. If I didn't have, safe sounding boards for talking about my experiences, or asking people their experiences, or even just having to think deeply about it. So I think that's been a big part of it as well.
Can you give an example an experience that shaped you?
Let me think. It's not necessarily like a race related example, but I grew up in a very small town, and I was a hard charger in high school, and I was student council president and captain of the whatever team and all that stuff. And Carly is my oldest, is very similar, very driven, very leadership driven. Her high school has 6,000 students. I had 14 kids in my class. So when I advise her on things like, running for student council, like it's a totally different experience. And she likes to remind us all the time that it was 800 years ago when we applied to college, and we know nothing about the college admissions process that she is now navigating, and our experiences are hardly relevant. So just sort of, again, like racially, it's because I didn't really, just the basic issues of just not being considered a threat, or not sometimes I think about if she's with a group of friends and they're all brown girls, and are they going to be treated differently than if it was a group of white Texas teenage girls? Like I don't know. But I can't just assume, oh, they're the same, what would have happened to me, or how I would have felt, or that there is or isn't malice in someone's reaction. So I don't want to ever assign malice or racism, but I also can't 100% ignore that it exists, like I could as a teen growing up in like super white rural America.
In a smaller community.
Yeah.
Got that. Karabi, you've been nodding your head vigorously throughout. So questions, reflections?
Well, it's funny, you were asking about examples where of Sarah, like when she, things that she may not understand, or you said it better. But the first thing that popped into my head is just in my own journey, I guess, around understanding racial issues in America. I remember a blog post, or maybe it was an article in the paper that I don't remember the name of the author, but it was a Black man, and it was a very well-educated, very wealthy Black man who was writing about this. It may have been in maybe 2014 or something, around the time of Michael Brown's death or something like that. And he just wrote this, he basically wrote about what we now call the talk, where he had to have the talk with his son about, if you buy gum, get a receipt. I don't, however small an item it is, get a receipt. If you're going to be running, make sure you have jogging clothes on, like all of these things. And I remember, like, that was all news to me. I did not know any of that. And, and I thought I was educated about this stuff. And I thought, I thought I knew about this stuff, but I think there's so much that we don't talk about across certain lines, like across racial lines, or we don't get outside of our bubbles to understand this. And that's been a little bit of my motivation around the multiracial conversation, is I just started realizing that, like, no one was really talking about it. And that for my own sense of self, like, I needed to start talking about it. Like, I mean, it sounds silly, but I don't know if you guys have heard of Loving Day. Do you know Loving Day?
No.
Sarah, you know Loving Day. So Loving Day is June 12th. And that is the day that the Supreme Court
The couple
interracial
marriage. Loving. Okay.
And do you know what year that was, Valerie?
74?
67.
67.
which is not that long ago.
No.
Which is not when my parents got married in 1964. So they got married in India, but it would have been illegal in many states in the United States. And I just decided this year for the first time that, you know what, I am going to kind of honor and recognize Loving Day in my house, in my life every year now, because I'm just like, we should talk about this, you know, and because until we talk about it, we can't share some of these experiences. So anyway.
What day is that?
June 12th.
June
so
12th.
It was just not too long.
Just passed it. Sarah, do you guys celebrate Loving Day?
We don't celebrate it, but you know, I remember when Ricardo and I were first dating, like the state of Alabama, it didn't enforce the laws about marriage and race, but it was like still technically in the Constitution until like the mid 90s. So it was like, didn't seem like a big enough deal to address. It was like, you know, and one of the things that we sort of established early on in our marriage was that Ricardo was like, I don't want to live in Vermont. I don't want to be the only Black person in a 40-mile radius. And I said, I don't want to live in Alabama. I don't want to raise mixed children in a place where racism is a part of the culture. You know, I know it's part of the culture in a lot of places, but in Alabama, it's
still fresh.
It's still fresh. Yes. And so, you know, we didn't know exactly where we'd end up, but it wasn't going to be Vermont and it wasn't going to be Alabama. So it's, you know, it's like a parallel journey to the Supreme Court case. It just, you know, it's still, even though it's been addressed, it wasn't that long ago, and the ripple effects they still exist.
And it's still under threat because there are proposed laws that give a lot of sort of power for individual county offices and clerks to have religious objections to certain marriages. And it's mostly been around gay marriage, and that's where a lot of the attention has been. But it could also be about interracial marriage. And the Defense of Marriage Act that was just passed, that Biden just passed, is it protects both. It protects both gay marriage and interracial marriage. And it was, you know, kind of chilling to me that both categories of marriages had to be called out in 2023.
Yeah.
I want to steer the conversation in a slightly different direction. So, Sarah, we'll start with you. Obviously, you were attracted to my brother. So I'm curious about what was the attraction? Was skin color anything to you as it related to what you saw or how you felt about it? And then Karabi, I'm not sure what your marital status is, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about relationship and what you've been attracted to over time. Because I'll tell you, and I've shared this on this podcast before, like my first crush was a Japanese guy, Japanese American guy, when we lived in Hawaii. I was like 12, 13 years old. And I didn't think anything of it at the time and didn't really make a big deal out of it. You know, it's a crush. And of course, all my little friends, you know, a lot of my friends in Hawaii were of Asian descent. So probably it was because I was with a lot of other people who were Asian, right? And that just seemed like the thing. There weren't that many Black people that I recall in my elementary or my junior high. And then it wasn't until I went to Alabama that I was like, okay, so maybe having a crush on a Japanese person was not the normal. That was not normal. There were not many Asian people then. And you know, when I walked into the cafeteria the first day and see all Blacks on one side, all whites on the other side, I'm like, that told me a whole different story. So Sarah, I get that whole idea about, you know, it was still kind of fresh in Alabama to think about. My parents would not have had the luxury of sending us or being in schools that were integrated if we'd grown up there, right? Like there's all these things that were very fresh still on the surface. But because of that, I've been always attracted to men that were of different ethnicities. That's kind of been my upbringing. So I'm curious about the two of you. Who are you attracted to, and what does skin color or ethnicity? Yeah, what does that play?
Well, I met Ricardo when I was 17 and was just starting at the Naval Academy. He was a couple years older. He was sort of like in a position of authority. And, you know, when I met him, that we were not in a position to be attracted to anyone because we were very busy being yelled at and made to do push-ups and whatnot.
Made to do.
But I think I would probably be lying to myself if I didn't admit that there was a sense of like, oh, I've never had the opportunity to be around people of other races. I mean, it's just simply, I mean, Vermont is just, I cannot tell you, it's just so white. And there are parts of Vermont, like by the university, that are more mixed and stuff. But where I lived, it was just a very small town, very, very white. Just that's just the way it was. And so, you know, if you saw, like, if you went up to the next town over that had like stores and a movie theater, and you saw a Black person walking down the street, like you would notice, not because of racism, but just because the sheer sort of like novelty of it, like, oh, not a white person. So, you know, I'm sure there was an element of that when I first got to the Naval Academy. But, you know, I don't, and he's very tall and he is very handsome. He remains that way today. But so I think it might have just had more to do with, you know, initially just his looks in general. But I mean, your brother is one of the kindest people. Like, he's just so kind, and he's just so kind to everyone. So I think that's,
you have to say that because you're his wife. I do not have to agree.
You know, I don't have, like, this is the thing. He thinks he's really funny, and I don't have the heart to tell him that he's not the funny one in our relationship. But yeah, he's just such a like good man, and like that's the thing. Like, I don't think I've ever run into someone where there wasn't like an undercurrent of like, maybe this guy's a jerk, maybe this guy's, you know, he's just never been that way. So and then, you know, 17. So we've been married for 22 years, but that was 4 years before we got married. So we've known each other for 26 years. So I didn't really have any other relationships since then. But
were you attracted to other men who are Black or other ethnicities?
I mean, who isn't? Like, I mean, you show me a picture of Idris Elba. Like, I mean, it is what it is. But I'm not like, I don't find, you know, people of other ethnicities unattractive. I don't really have I wouldn't say I have a type. No. I mean, I like Jason Momoa. I like that. Yeah. So
Jason Momoa.
I sometimes like dreamcast onto my children, like, you know who I think you'd like?
I love it.
Son-in-law like this man, like, you know, like but obviously
I think you dreamcast that on me.
Okay, hey, you know,
that's funny. Karabi, what about you? Who and what are you attracted to as it relates to? I
know that it has a racial element to it. I mean, I'm married to an Indian man, and I think I mean, there's many, you know, obviously many things go into, you know, choosing a spouse, but I do think part of it was kind of my continual search for belonging. And so just feeling loved and accepted and having sort of a guide to Indian culture. I'm sure that was a part of the attraction. But I've dated Black guys, I've dated white guys. No other Indians actually. But
how'd y'all meet? How'd y'all meet?
We just met through family, friends, and
is it arranged?
No.
Oh,
yeah. But we have, I was laughing, Sarah, because my youngest daughter is 18 and I have 2 kids, and my younger was 18. And so we are also going through the college process. She starts college in a couple months, actually. So I don't know where you are in the process. But, you know, one of the things, and it just reminded me, one of the things that people, whenever I talk to mixed race people, that comes up all the time is what to check off on the forms. And like a lot of college applications are like, check 1, you know, are you Black, white, Latino, Asian, like check one. And so we did have conversations about that, but anyway, sorry, I know you want to talk about romance and stuff. I'm trying to think.
No,
I
that
do
was
have
the initial.
a lot of celebrity crushes, I will admit.
Oh yeah, who's a celebrity crush?
Well, Idris Elba, you know, it is true.
It's the whole world's crush.
Yeah, everyone loves him. And then I will confess to Chris Martin, just because he's the lead singer of Coldplay.
Oh, okay, yeah. Interesting.
Mostly because I just think he's this kind man, and I love his music. So,
well, see, my celebrity crushes are Trevor Noah.
oh,
yeah,
well,
and
that's true.
And Hassan Minhaj.
Oh,
yeah. So yours has more to do with
I need, yeah. Well, there's been,
well, Trevor, I'm with you on Trevor.
There's something about a foreign man. I don't even, that has always been an appeal. And not even just the accent, but different culture. Like I always feel like I get to be a different version of myself. And you mentioned this whole search for belonging. So, when we immigrated to the States, we lived in military bases. And so military bases, everybody is from somewhere else. So, the sense of belonging, although it could be kind of superficial, it didn't seem at least a big deal. But when I remember moving to Alabama and we had to go to a local high school, there was no high school on base. There was a whole different set of rules of cultural and societal norms, because these are kids that had grown up, whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had grown up in the same region. So there was a whole different sense. And I didn't really feel like I didn't feel like I belonged, basically, until I joined the band. And then it was another band of misfits kind of thing. But when we went to college, my older brother and I went to the same University of Alabama. And it looked like it was going to be the same thing, right? My first semester in the dorm, but because my older brother is a couple of years ahead of me, he was a couple of years ahead of me in school, and he used to play soccer all the time. He was surrounded by people from other countries. And it wasn't until I started hanging out with him and his friends that I finally I felt I could relax. I don't know what it is exactly. I can't quite put my finger on it. If it's the immigrant thing, although I was here since I was 9. So most of these students had been there just to study. So they were still citizens of their home country and just coming in for the 4 years or however long they were there for school. But there was something about that experience where I just didn't feel like I had to explain myself. I didn't have to explain how I got there, why I spoke the language, Spanish and English, and why I had an accent here and I didn't have an accent. Like I didn't have any of those things to consider. So I've always felt like I belonged more with an international crowd, and my friendships look like that. And all my relationships have looked like that. My ex-husband was from Argentina. I dated a guy from India, a guy I'm dating from Egypt now. I mean, that's always been kind of the world I created for myself. The one thing I want to go back to, and and it just kind of popped in my head recently. You all were talking about, I think, Karabi, you mentioned your mom had all this education, right? She was kind of an activist. Sara, I think you would have rocked it in the 60s. Like I could see you, civil rights movement, you would have been at the front of it, right? Because you're just such an advocate and you're so committed and you have a lot of conviction around it. But I see a distinction in what the two of you said about the level of education and awareness and then an intellectual level. And then if you double click into the conversations that one has, so that you know what box to check off on the forms, or, hey, how do I connect with somebody that might be a different ethnicity or skin color or whatever? And if I fall in love with somebody that's different, right? So I'm just curious, in the two of you, what's your distinction? You personally, what has maybe started off as something intellectual and now is kind of seeped into the bones, right? Especially with your kids, because you're educating now your kids to see the world and traverse the world. What comes up for you around that?
I think in our family, it's a really interesting conversation because your side of the family is Black Hispanic or Afro-Antillean, we get it all. And so it's like 3 boxes, right? Like it's white, Black, Hispanic. I guess I mean, I don't think they would say like Caribbean if but I think Carly Mike, she very much identifies with that element of her heritage. And I remember having a very lengthy conversation with a census taker at one point, because you have to say like, and the assumption was that Ricardo was Black and I was white Hispanic, so it's like, oh, you can't, like, white Hispanic is a thing, but Black Hispanic, so that's, and so she was very confused. We were living in Southern California at the time. And, but I think much like you, Valerie, like we work really hard to, like, we're very proud of our service. We're very proud of our country and the freedoms that we have in America. But I really want my kids to identify more as citizens of the world than as citizens of one place. And so just embracing, what makes, because we live in a really diverse town, which is my favorite thing about living here. They have friends from all over, and just like finding those things that make their friends different, and what can they learn about their cultures, and just making it a safe place to be from these places. And I having come from a very homogenous start, it's really important to me that they foster friendships of all different, that's not not that it's not a consideration, but that it's like a bonus. It's like, to have a diverse friend group is great. Like, it's a positive, and they're going to go out into the world and experience diversity in a completely different way than I did. And I don't know, that's something that I'm really excited for them. And I used to think I would have to live overseas to really to have that for myself. And Texas has been like a real surprise in that way, that it's so diverse here. I would probably be hard pressed to find a place as diverse anywhere. I think Hawaii might be the only exception, because everyone there is mixed. So it's such like, it's just it's like 60% of the population is mixed. It's like the only place where people who aren't mixed are in the minority. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's good. And you live in Dallas, Texas, in a specific community. So there's definitely a large percentage. I think what I was leaning more towards is around the conversations you guys are having, because that's something that the two of you brought up that was really distinct in your upbringing versus how you're bringing up your kids and how you're now having conversations. And part of the reason I brought it up again was, I do a lot of work with different organizations, and especially around leadership, relationship building, trust building, right? Being authentic in communication. And I'm hard pressed sometimes with the way we address conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or other conversations, as a matter of fact, by coming at it from a very cerebral, very intellectual, using the right terminology, right? Which is the right boxes to check. That there's so much of an emphasis in that. And the example I can give you is, I've had on my podcast a few conversations with people from the LGBTQIA+ community, right? And the very first time it was like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. These two women, they're lesbian, but, I didn't want to use the wrong term. And I wanted to make sure I was very, knowledgeable, but it made the conversation so much more difficult, because I found myself always kind of checking first. Is this the right thing? Is this weird? Is this appropriate? It's not appropriate. And the most authentic version of myself was not able to express as well. Now that was like 2 years ago. Fast forward, the most recent conversation I had was different, in that I no longer had that I didn't impose those rules on myself that I had to use the right terminology, but I would just ask more questions more openly and allow the two gentlemen to guide, right? So we were talking about Pride Month, and And both of them were like, we don't want to do it the way other people are doing it. We kind of have a quiet pride. And it was just like, oh, there's such a thing. And so it just gave us a whole different, different access. So I guess my concern or my question is more around, how do we take the conversations that you guys are having in your families or having with your friends out of the intellectual realm with this terminology and knowing the history, and which is important. I'm not discarding or trying to cast some negative light on that, but how do you make them more humane, right? Bringing the empathy to it.
I don't know if this is an answer to your question totally, but one of the things that my kids and I have been trying to do more and more is what I kind of call like little acts of resistance. And some of them are really small. Like for the longest time, we all, like if you go to a like Starbucks or whatever and they ask for your name, we would make up names because we have complicated names and then it was like, no, like we're gonna give our real name. We're just gonna give our real name and we're gonna laugh about how it's spelled. But I will say more and more, the folks will ask, how do you spell that? And how do you pronounce that? And it's just like, it's a tiny thing to say, there are a lot of different kinds of names and, we can learn to pronounce them and we can learn to spell them. And, there's many, many different, so, in little things like that, I've started kind of keeping a running list. So I get asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? Like, what are you, like, endlessly. And you talk to like most mixed people and they'll say the same thing. And it drives people slightly crazy at times, I think. And so I have kind of a running list of responses that I give. And some of them are funny and silly. And I learned this from a friend when I watched her answer this. She was mixed and I watched her answer this question and she answered it very like honestly, and she took the time, like it was a 10-minute answer. And then it started up this fabulous conversation between her and the person who had asked it. And I was just like, wow, that's really cool. So like I am trying to force myself in the right circumstances with the right people to, we don't all have a one-word answer to like, where are you from? Like some of these stories are complicated. So just little thing, like trying to put it into action, trying to make the kind of the mixed experience just a part of our daily life, in small ways and big ways. And trying to change some of, like changing the norms and forms, right? And of course, there was a big movement to change the census form that was very successful ultimately. And so as of 2010 in the census, you can check off more than one. And that was a result of advocacy. So I don't know if that's really an answer to your question, but that was what came to mind.
No, it's perfect. And I get my question may be a little complicated too, but I love that you were saying these small acts of resistance. And I guess what I heard and what you said is really just be more authentic. Like, this is what my lived experience is, and not diminishing it or trying to make it simpler or easier or accommodating the other individual or the perception of the need to accommodate, more so than just like, hey, this is what's up. And if you really want to know, here's the 10-minute answer. And if they wish they never asked, well, that's on you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sarah, what about you? I did want to ask you a specific question around this, Sarah, because I remember there was a meal where your mom was present. And I think the kids are really talking a lot, very deeply about racial identity and all that. And there was a point in time when I kind of felt like, ooh, this might be a difficult conversation for your mother to hear, or even participate in. And I think she'd asked a question, I don't want to mischaracterize, so I don't know exactly what the question was, but I got the sense that it was an uncomfortable conversation to be a part of or present to. What's been your experience in hearing your kids talk about race the way they talk about it?
It can be uncomfortable. My 6-year-old will say things that if a white child said would be like, who are your parents? Because they are racist. Like she, she'll say like dumb kid stuff. Like, one time she said, I like on the show when the peach people fall down. And I'm just like, okay, well, mommy's peach, and I, like maybe we shouldn't like it when a certain color of skin falls, but I'm just like, I think to myself, there are probably parents out there that if their kids said, I like it when brown people fall down, they would be mortified. And so, I think that when I talk to people, when I talk to other white parents in particular, I just try to I try to encourage them to not be scared of having the conversations and just be like a safe place for them to talk about that stuff, not in a way that sort of condones, bad behavior, but just, not overreacting to things. And so I try to do that in our own home. It's just, let's talk through that. And part of it is that being the youngest of 5 and having big brothers and sisters and trying to like outrage people and just shock value. Yeah, it's, I and also acknowledging that I'm not, like, after 22 years and 5 kids, it's not like I've achieved enlightenment and now I am like the expert on anything. I'm constantly learning. My kid, and you were talking about LGBT issues, like my kids correct me constantly. I'll use a term and they'll say, oh, you can't, that's not that. And I'm like, but I think I'm being like, I'm like, but I thought that was, and they're like, no, mom, that's not right. And I'm like, okay. And I can sort of feel in myself a defensiveness that I'm sure people feel about racial issues as well when they're sort of called out or corrected or asked to look at their own privilege. It's that sort of defensiveness of like, but I'm trying, and just learning to sort of say, it's not personal, and it's just being open to growing and changing, and not, just because things were this way for a long time doesn't mean they have to stay that way. Sometimes I feel like that old person that's like, I'm not going to learn how to program a VCR. I'm too old, like, I'm just like, and I understand why people feel that way, because there's a lot and things are changing rapidly, and just language and social norms and stuff. But just realizing that those changes aren't personal. They're not an attack on you. So in our house, that's, constantly humbled, constantly forced to like look at my own biases and things like that.
Yeah, I love that it is not personal. And it's almost like all of us are trying to kind of carve a little space for ourselves so that we can be a more informed, but yet a more authentic version of ourselves. And sometimes that requires a different, to negotiate differently. Okay, yeah, this term doesn't work for me, or this particular assumption doesn't work for me. And when we can have these conversations really openly, it's quite delightful, actually, because you get to negotiate. I mean, it happens in every relationship, right? It could be something as simple as, how cold should the room be? Right? What's appropriate? I experienced hot flashes at this point in my life. And so I like things to be a little bit cool, but really what I want is wind. I don't necessarily want cold, freezing air. I need breeze, which is why I have fans everywhere, right? So when Ahmad and I went on, the guy I'm dating, so when he and I went on a road trip, and I started to fan myself, he would turn on the air conditioning like at full blast. And I'm like, it's freezing. And I'm like, I don't want it to be freezing. I want a lot more air, but not colder. But it was interesting. And it sounds like a small example, but the idea of being able to calibrate living, right? Things that would make me more comfortable, things that would make it more make it easier. And for the other person to also want to accommodate to some measure, right? But without having a conversation where I can distinguish for myself, actually, this is what would make the biggest difference. This is what would be most helpful, and asking for it in a way that's still respectful, is still empathetic. Somebody's willing to make that accommodation and offer, hey, does this work for you? Would this be okay? And then we can meet in a place that makes the most sense. And that's kind of how I see these conversations happen, right? When we can have a bigger, deeper impact this way. Yeah.
Well, I was just, as you were talking, one of the things that has been part of sort of my journey is that I had no idea what I wanted. Like if someone said, oh, what would make it better? What would make it easier? What questions or how, I had no idea. Because I was so busy trying to fit into a particular container, whether American or Indian or what, and all of my energy and attention was focused on fitting in, that I myself didn't know what I liked or wanted or what, I believed really. And I think that's the other reason to talk about this stuff, is because through that, then you start to think, oh, well, what is the real me, and what do I really think about this? And, even just the term mixed, right? There's a lot of people who don't like that word to describe people because it implies that there's a pure something. Or the
never saw that.
Never. Well, it's out there, right? Like there are people who really feel very insulted by the word mixed. And then there are people who, so even these words, and I've been struggling with this in my book because I'm like, well, what word should I use? I personally, I use multiracial, but it feels very sort of, I don't know, science-y. It doesn't feel, but then the mixed, I'm kind of sensitive to that argument, and I want to be inclusive and whatever. But it's just such a perfect example, like for this community, we don't even have words that people, in the community love and can agree on and are like, yeah, that's the one. So I guess I'm just saying, like, even if you ask, we don't always know what you want.
I think that's just us humans in many ways. We are, just a basket of contradictions. We say we want one thing, but in the action, we might project something different. But I think what you're saying is there's an opportunity for sometimes the contrast to inform us, when it's sometimes easier to say what I don't want or what I don't like, and then use that as a jumping off board for, okay, here's what would be better for me, or at least at this point in time. Y'all have any questions for each other as you've been hearing your examples and experiences? What questions do you have?
I had a question. I was curious, Karabi. So your husband is Indian, so your children are, I'm assuming, 3/4 Indian, right? Do you notice differences or similarities in their experiences to yours, or like what has been your observation of how they've been growing up?
Yeah, and it's interesting. My sister married a white American guy, and so her kids are 3/4 white American, and so it's just interesting. I think, well, like you were saying, I learned so much from my kids, right? And they are growing up in a very different world than I'm growing up, in that they I remember my daughter, my older one, when she was in high school, she was part of I don't know, some school group, and they created t-shirts that had actually the categories, the racial categories with the boxes, and then on the back it was like no labels. and I was just like, how cool is that? Like, that would never have occurred. I'm like such a rule follower. I was like, okay, I have to check this box. I'm not allowed to check that box. They're like, forget the boxes, like let's forget them. They don't work. They don't fit. And that's just, I think it's partly who they are, but it's also partly the world that they are growing up in, where a lot of our ways of organizing, people in particular, are being called into question, whether it's gender or sexuality or race and ethnicity. And I think it has helped that both of them have been in communities with tremendous diversity, like just kids from all over the world, and many kids who are mixtures of all different kinds of things, both biologically and experience, also like cross-racial adoptions, like just every sort of permutation and combination of culture and ethnicity has just been a part of their community. And that is radically different from mine, right? Like, as I said, I didn't know a single person until I was 23. And I think that lends strength, and it lends a sort of a normalcy or a validation of like, yeah, I'm not weird. I'm, like we're all kind of mixes. And so I do think it's very different. And in some ways, like I talk about like my struggle. I think their struggles are different, so.
Karabi, do you have questions?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about like, across your 5 kids, how do they talk to each other about this? And you mentioned that, like, I've been doing a lot of interviews of people who are mixed and or multiracial, and one of the things that comes up is how your physical appearance sort of quote matches or doesn't match your own identity. And I'm wondering if that's been an issue for your kids, because I know sometimes siblings, they look very, very different, and one might be white passing and the other might not. And so I'm curious, do they talk to each other about those kinds of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the 3 older ones. And my oldest is the lightest of my kids. And sometimes, they talk about it, and sometimes very respectfully and sometimes very pointedly. And especially my one son, he can be a little bit of a bully sometimes with his sisters. And so like, I don't know if you're familiar with the paper bag test, but it was like so sometimes like we went to the African American Heritage Museum in DC a couple of years ago, and the kids learned about that. And one of my children passes the paper bag test, and essentially, and one of them does, of my older girls. And so it was kind of this, I think they'd always identified like one's lighter and one's darker, but then it was kind of like, oh, you might have back in the day, like you might have passed and I wouldn't have passed. And there's sort of, there is some tension. Sometimes they will say things that I think are kind of cruel to each other, but I think they sort of use humor as like a juvenile kind of, just that this is how we cope with these differences, and we make jokes, but if someone else made a joke, it absolutely would not land. And but yeah, it's knowing that they could have very different experiences in life based on where they live, how they look, who they marry. One of my children has expressed to me that they would be reticent to date a white person because they wouldn't want their children, they wouldn't want to essentially sort of dilute the color of their children to, and that's something like, which I understand, but I'm, it's like, okay, I get that. I know you wouldn't love your children any less, but, and they're young. And so they're sort of basically saying, I don't think I would be able to relate to a kid that, that looked different than me, which is,
wow.
Something I do have some experience with that, but it's, and I know they would be fine, but just knowing that in their teenage mind, that's something that they're thinking about. And like you mentioned, like your kids' cousins, like what would have, I could have very different looking grandbabies. But we've always sort of embraced that's part of what makes our family great, is that, and, you mentioned transracial adoption. One of the things we get a lot of, like, oh, you're Rosa's mom, like from kids, like, oh, I didn't realize. And I'm used to it by now because it's the norm. But just like when we would meet kids who were adopted transracially, being able to say, like, I'm not an adoptee, but I don't look like my parents either.
Right.
And that's not what makes you a family. And so I just, I've always liked that we had that sort of, like, or sometimes people would say, like, oh, you look like your mom and you look like your dad. And you sort of go, is it because I light hair? I don't, but yeah, it's a challenge, and it's hard because I have to be very careful how much I participate in those conversations. Obviously, I can't make jokes, I would, and so, I mean, I could, but it would be in very poor taste, and I don't want to sort of do anything harmful to my children. I make other jokes at their expense, just not about race. But yeah, but no, that's a great question. Thank you.
This has been a fascinating conversation. As we begin to wrap up the conversation, I'm curious about what are the two of you taking away? What stood out to you? What's been a highlight, and any of that?
I mean, I would just say, I just appreciate the opportunity and space to talk about these issues, because I do think so much of the conversation about race in America is a Black-white conversation. And I think that's a critically important conversation to have, of course. But I also think it's important to have a conversation about what it is like to grow up multiracial, to parent kids who are multiracial. So I really appreciate the conversation.
Cool. I want to add one thing to what you just said, that I think part of the Black-white conversation, this is my sense, is that there's still a lot of trauma about it. There's a lot of healing that has not been done, some of it because things have been either swept under the rug, or, I mean, we're talking generational trauma. And I think in any part of life, in my experience, and I work with people all the time as a coach, where symptoms keep coming up over and over again, and we try to cover over the symptoms with okay, here's a law, here's a policy, here's a term, like all these different very can sometimes be superficial things, is because we are not really dealing with the root cause. And I think the root cause permeates in so many different areas, and what it is, Black and white thing, has an impact on all the other things, all the other ethnicities, and all the other immigrant status or sexual orientation. Like, all of these things are born out of sometimes a lack of, let's find a way to heal some of the damage or the trauma that people have experienced over generations, because there's so much judgment and hurt or shame or guilt or anger, or, like, there's so many of these feelings, and those are the most the ones that destroy the most the fabric of humanity that we're trying to build, right? Like, we're trying to cover all these holes, and this is not something that we can do from a sense of lack. So I think this generation, my honest and my sincere hope is that the generation of people that you all have brought up into this world are actually here to heal a lot of those things, because they are the no labels, right? They are having conversations in ways that we would have never dreamt of when we were their age. They're bringing things to the surface that have been buried for a long period of time. And as they continue to permeate all these different areas of society and our structures, the professions, our government, I think it'll look very different in 20 years than what we're experiencing now because of that. And you two have a big role to play, because you're creating that environment and that comfort and that confidence in them today. So that's my 2 cents, what I'm taking away. Sarah, what about you?
I think that the thing I'm taking away So jumping off of what you just mentioned about the divides and the generational issues and the things that still haven't been healed, is that, you know, people who have those multiple cultures and multiple ethnicities, they provide a wonderful bridge between these differences. And, you know, we know that one of the best things you can do to address biases and prejudices is to be in relationship, is familiarity. And so just being in relationship, being in conversation, and you know, people who are mixed, like, that's its own thing that needs to be explored. And it, you know, because for so long it's been one or the other, but it's also like, what a wonderful way to like build out, like, you know, I understand this and I understand this, and I can talk to both sides about it, and I can create understanding between the sides. And yeah, so I'm also very hopeful for the future, because you've got all these kids who are part of all these different things, and they're going to be able to grow up and have an understanding of different things, and be that bridge, but then also have the platform to discuss what it means to be at a crossroads, to have multiple things, that it's, you know, to hold those two truths in themselves and have to decide, you know, who they are and how they identify. So I think having a place for that discussion, like Karabi's book, like, to be able to talk about, is so important. But and then also moving forward, like to have like those inroads into multiple sides of issues is also, you know, that's how that healing's going to happen. And so the more connections on that web and that network, the better. So I'm excited for that.
They're like walking out with like multiple passports. Choose an adventure. Oh, fantastic. Ladies, you've been such a delight. Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because I invited you purposely, knowing that this would be an interesting and enriching conversation. But I'm really surprised about the levels of that we covered. There's been so much, not only on the holistic level, but also personal. We talked about romance, we talked about your children, we talked about all the things. So I so appreciate your being so open to having a conversation like this. And I hope this is not the only time that the two of you connect, and that those that have been listening perhaps find a new way to relate to the people in their lives, or perhaps asking some interesting questions. Any final words before we wrap up?
Just thank you so much, Valerie, for getting us together and for, you know, making the space for the conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure.
It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be.
It wasn't as bad.
I appreciate that.
You made it.
Yeah. And I'm glad there will be several weeks before this is like published, so I can forget I did it and then don't have to think about it and be nervous.
You can be pleasantly surprised at the end. Fantastic. Thank you too. Don't go anywhere, but thank you for the rest of you who've been tuning into this episode of Not Quite Strangers. Again, please rate, favorite us, tag us, or subscribe in any of your favorite podcast platforms. We're so fortunate to have you as part of our community as well, and want to make sure that you don't miss a single episode. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody.
You've been listening to the podcast Not Quite Strangers. Be sure to subscribe or follow on your favorite video or podcast platform. And for more information and content, go to notquitestrangers.com. See you next time.